The book's been concerned with a number of topics: the nature of proposition, the nature of philosophy, the nature and status of the propositions of logic, solipsism and ethics. And what he's trying to get us to see in relation to all of those topics is something that's expressed in proposition: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And what unifies these topics is that each of them is a focus for philosophical confusion. And the sense of seven, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent, is that these confusions all have their origin in our desire to speak of something, to represent in a proposition something that can't be spoken or represented in a proposition. Now, I think this is not to be understood as him committing himself to the idea of ineffable truths, to the idea that there are deep truths about the world that have to be grasped wordlessly. It's rather that there's a danger in taking something that has nothing to do with anything as being true or false and treating it as if it can be represented as a truth. Now, the idea is clearer in connection with some of the topics than others, and perhaps it's clearest in connection with language.
My view is slightly different to Murray's, actually, because it seems to me that Wittgenstein does believe that there are truths that are ineffable. I think Wittgenstein felt this, that there are ethical truths, there are religious truths, there are truths about the meaning of life, and that all of these truths are at one and the same time enormously important and unsayable. Now, he'd already distinguished between saying and showing in discussing logic. His view was, broadly speaking, this, that what Russell had tried to say about logic can't be said. And when Russell got into problems, theorized, do you remember his original question was, what is logic? Russell had had a go at answering that question, but had got himself enmeshed in problems, paradoxes, contradictions. Wittgenstein's diagnosis of that was that the reason he was getting himself into such a series of messes was that he'd misunderstood the limits of language. He thought he could say something which has to be shown. Now, thinking of the picture theory, if you imagine a person and then a picture of the person, the picture has to have something in common with the person in order to be a picture. There has to be some similarity, something in common between the picture and the person. Now, Wittgenstein's claim was that you can't picture what a picture has to have in common. So a proposition can picture a fact, but a proposition can't picture the pictorial relationship. That has to be shown, right? It's a bit like seeing a similarity. If you see a similarity between a mother and a daughter, you see the mother, you see the daughter. The similarity isn't a third thing that you see, right? When you see a similarity between a mother and a daughter. Well, you know, that's a rough analogy to what's going on here. You've got the proposition, you've got the picture, but you cannot have another proposition that's picturing the picturing relationship. So that has to be shown rather than said. Now, the awkward thing is that includes everything that Wittgenstein himself has said in the Tractatus. So, on the traditional interpretation, which is also my interpretation, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus is trying to get across something that he himself regards as impossible to say. And then he ends, you know, towards the end of the Tractatus, he says that the reader who understands him sees that Wittgenstein's own propositions in the Tractatus themselves are senseless. However, the very awkward thing is that in the preface, he talks about the truth of the thoughts contained in this book. And so I think he does think that there are truths that have to be shown, and I think there is a connection here with the various mystical traditions. You know, after all, the thought that the deepest truths are those which are unsayable is not new to Wittgenstein. It's part of Taoism, it's part of Buddhism, it's part of a whole series of mystical traditions.
Look, here's the thing that Ray's talking about that's paradoxical. The idea is that you're trying to draw the limits to language, the limits to what's intelligible in thought and language. The trouble with drawing a limit is that you seem to have to stand on both sides of the line. There's something a little bit odd about saying, here's the boundary, we can't go beyond it, because to understand the boundary is to sort of see where it's drawn. So he's worried about how we actually describe limits without breaching them, without being outside them. Now, what are the limits? The limits are the limits of what you can say in science. Science has got a perfectly good job of trying to describe the way the world is and how things work. Now, what about all the things that we can't put into scientific speak? We might want to say that the world has a certain meaning for us, or that things are valuable. Now, when we say that life has a value or has a meaning, as Wittgenstein points out, that's not just one more fact. It's not going to be found in the world alongside water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius and certain facts about chemical substances. So what are we to make of that idea that the world has value, or that there's a meaning to our lives? Instead of it being something that we state in another proposition, or that scientists might investigate, it's not a part of the world, it's an attitude to the world. It's a way that we regard the world. So if you've got the facts in front of you, there's something else that you can do other than just list them. You can take up a stance in respect of what you find there, and that's what gives the world its ethical value. That's what we might have over and above. Now, that's for Wittgenstein. In doing philosophy, one's doing something like that. One's trying to say, look, philosophy's job is just to say what can intelligibly be said, and that's maybe to remind ourselves that what can be intelligibly said is said by science. But then where does philosophy belong? Is it also a science? No, it's not. So it's got to be not another body of doctrine, it's got to be an activity, a way of describing the relationship between language and the world. But if you're describing the relationship between language and the world, you seem to be slightly outside language. That's paradoxical for him. So at the end, he says, my book's deeply dishonest. If you've understood what I'm saying, that only certain propositions are meaningful, what are we to make of philosophical propositions? They look as though they're not meaningful, and now he's breached his own limits.
Yes, to go back to the question that Ray Monk said first interested Wittgenstein in writing the Tractatus, what is logic? That both Russell and Frege had treated logic as if it was a kind of science itself, that it expressed the most general truths about the world. Wittgenstein thinks there are deep problems with that. And actually it's coming to see that logic has to do with the rules by which we can represent anything at all. Its status as the rules of representation, and that it's for that, so it's going away from Ray's thought that it's because they're ineffable truths. It's because the status of logic is actually something to do with the rules by which we can say anything, the condition of our expressing a proposition, that those rules can't themselves be expressed as propositions. So that's it's a kind of clarification. It's not, I think, a kind of mysticism.